Welcome back to the last of the formal sessions. My name is Ronald Atlas. I'm a member of the steering committee, and this particular session is a follow-up to yesterday's session that Barry Bloom chaired on the international or global aspects of the questions surrounding gain of function. Yesterday, we really did hear the perspective from Europe, primarily, with a perhaps more global view coming from the WHO, but it was very much a discussion of what has been a robust discussion within Europe on gain of function. In today's session, we extend our consideration into Asia and the Middle East and Australia. And given that the three viruses that have been a central focus of discussion in the US and the focus of the pause of funding being influenza and SARS and MERS, it's very appropriate to gain the perspectives from Asia and the Middle East, since that's where those viruses are rapidly evolving naturally and where their work is presumed to be helping in the eventual prevention of a pandemic caused by some of those strains. Unlike the previous sessions, none of our speakers brought slides. We're just going to be talking heads up here. And we're going to start off with George Gao from China and ask for his perspective on how, first of all, China might harmonize with anything the US does. How can there be cooperation? What are the mechanisms for that? And also to press him a little bit on the perspective for SARS and influenza viral work. George.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I also would like to thank the organizers to invite me to be here to share some of our thoughts, maybe my thoughts about the gain of function research. So then why don't I have any slides? Because I found this slide is much better than mine. So I'd like to keep this one. So this is the best, I keep it. So the first point I want to make and to discuss with you, I already made something yesterday. So we are discussing something about the risk and the benefit. So what kind of risk we would encounter, what kind of benefit we can gain from all this research. So I will give you an example. I mentioned yesterday a little bit, but I'll give you an example about H7N9 influenza when we encountered in 2013. So when you think about the evolution or the mutations of any given viruses like H7N9. So because I'm a lab guy, I did a lot of work on MERS, Ebola, and influenza for the host jump. When you try to spot the mutations or mutations in the genome, you can imagine, based on whatever you obtain from previous research, you thought, okay, this is the mutation, this is the amino acid, might be responsible for the mutation, for example, for the H7N9 to switch from AV receptor binding to the HOMO receptor binding. So then you say, okay, this is this time, we isolated so many different kind of viruses. So we see the original one, the bind only AV receptor. And the later stage, we got something that bound better for the HOMO receptors. But then based on all this, H7N9, H1N1, H2N2, and H3, and also the H3. So you imagine, so the virus will go that direction. If you have another mutation, that position of the gene, of the HA, they might obtain the transmission ability to human beings. But now, 4 years, it never happened. So the point I want to make, do we, the human being, have enough capacity to test all these hypotheses? So that means we are risking the test, but what kind of benefit or gain we can get from all those mutations? So you can imagine, you can do a lot of experiments, but you might miss one important one. That's one in the later stage, the nature will select for this virus. So the conclusion, my conclusion will be, maybe it's not necessary to spend a lot of money to do all this experiment, even the loss of function. So as a scientist, they want to do something. So what can we direct the scientists to do something else? For example, now we have Zika. Why don't we try to attract those top scientists to move from their own interest, influenza, MERS, come to work on Zika or something else? I think, by using their expertise, their experience on the, the gain of function research or, natural selection research for some virus to work on some newly emerging virus. And maybe that's the solution for the scientist interest, because, a lot of research is driven by the interest. Just scientists have the interest. So this is my first point I want to make. Because I'm in the section, so we are discussing of the international governance. Now I want to give you an example. So international collaboration, coordination, and governance are very important. We need harmonizing and all these efforts together. In 2012, when I just moved from the Chinese Academy of Sciences into China CDC, we had one case, two scientists, one in China CDC, the other one from Harvard. So one American, one Chinese scientist. They are working together. So they are doing some test for the golden rice, in China. Golden rice, transgenic is something good. Of course, I don't want to speak more about the GOM foods, so that's another topic. However, what I want to say, international governance is important because when you look at the agreement in Chinese and in English, they are different copies. So when they try to sign an agreement or, with the parents of the Chinese kids, they did the test. They claim something else. And instead, when they made application for the NIH, for the grant, they wrote something in the other way. So that means we didn't communicate well. So the scientists, like this morning we discussed, scientists, they are human beings. So sometimes they want to hide something. So this is why yesterday I also said something about that we need to do the oversight or supervision of the process, not just the policy decision. So give them the chance or right to do some experiment. We need to monitor, do the monitoring of the whole process. So that's also very, very important. So this is my what I want to say for all this first. And then, how can we do the international governance? I believe we need some, meeting like this. So here, I'm here today, only, on my behalf, maybe a little bit on the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I would encourage we should have some, government level meetings, like at least the National Academy of Sciences here with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, have the third or this is the second, the symposium together. So our voice must be heard by the top officials, not just in this country, but also in China and also any other countries, because this is very important for the policy makers. And in China, we also facing some problems. For example, by the regulation in the Ministry of Health, any scientist, you are not allowed to mix two viruses together in a single cell. However, there's no such a regulation in the agriculture sector. So nowadays, zoonotic viruses, it's very difficult to say. It's a human pathogen, also animal pathogen. So, and we are also trying to do some harmonizing regulation between agriculture sector and human or health sectors. This is we at the moment we have some problem, for that. So my last point I want to say, so the gain of function experiment must be highly regulated. So I think the experiment We don't want the scientists to do all of these kind of experiments because of their interest. Maybe we need highly regulated lab, like the US CDC, or Army lab, or in China, the same Army lab, or China CDC, to set up some kind of this experiment to attract the scientists to get into these highly regulated labs to set up all these experiments. So anyway, that's my points I want to make. I'm ready to make to discuss with all the audience after all my friends here make their points. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Gabriel, and we'll get a perspective from Hong Kong. And again.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you to the National Academy of Sciences for bringing me here all this way. And I'm going to focus my remarks on the following headings. First, I'm going to argue that we should put gain-of-function research in context. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the global dimension, which I believe is critically important to our considerations here. Third, I should like to talk about a reality check. And finally, I'm going to have a few specific reactions to the past 48 hours and some of the points that have been made. So let me start with context. I just alluded to the fact that I just got off a plane and I'm about to go back on a plane in a few hours. So let me take the 35,000 feet view of things. Our discussion is one of risk to human and, to a lesser extent, ecological security. Second, by their very nature, infectious pathogens do not respect national borders, hence are global. And if we put together those two facts, or at least assertions, we are therefore considering a global security issue and not simply a US national health security concern here. And as such, I would encourage you to consider reading the National Academy of Medicine's recent report, The Neglected Dimension of Global Security, a framework to counter infectious disease crises. Now, if we take what I've just said in the preamble as motivation, the primary outcome of interest is surely how to keep the global population safe from the potential consequences of gain-of-function research. That is, how to keep the global population safe from dangerous pathogens, and by dangerous, I mean either it's highly virulent, highly transmissible, and/or highly resistant, according to the NSABB report, that may eventually enter into human circulation. Now, if we agree that that is the primary outcome of interest, at this point, I should like to introduce the concept of hazard analysis and critical control point, or HACCP, which would be very familiar to those of you who come from a food safety enterprise perspective. In fact, the HACCP idea really dates back to the 60s when NASA invited Pillsbury to supply food for space missions. In a nutshell, HACCP almost, if you take it literally, it really means that they're looking for the weakest link along the entire supply chain. So where is the weakest link in keeping the global population safe from the impact of dangerous pathogens, including those that may arise from gain-of-function research? I would argue that it would be the lack of country preparedness as per the international health regulation requirements, let alone the more stringent GHSA framework. When a significant minority of countries around the world self-declare that they're not yet IHR compliant, and with a further unverified self-reported adherent proportion likely not reaching the accepted standards. I think herein lies the Achilles heel of keeping the global population safe from dangerous pathogens. Now, while this should in no way be an excuse for more loosely considering gain-of-function research of concern, we should view the potential risks of gain-of-function research in context. That is, there is plenty we can and in fact must do first. For example, in strengthening health protection function of national and subnational health systems, that would be much more impactful in relative terms, going towards the same end of keeping the global population safe from dangerous bugs. In fact, by the third criterion of what may constitute gain-of-function research of concern, pushing for universal IHR compliance would, as a happy corollary, boost the mitigation capacity such that the proportion of gain-of-function research that would be deemed of concern is minimized. Now I move on to my second heading of global dimension. Because of the second assertion I made in the preamble, that is, the high degree of externality, which is an inherent nature of infectious agents, a globally harmonized order on gain-of-function research is a prerequisite to achieving global human security. And on this point of internationalism, I note and have learnt from the discussions yesterday that EASAC has issued a relatively more permissive set of recommendations a few months ago. Whereas largely tacit responses remain from other countries whose labs have been involved in gain-of-function research thus far. Some have even called it a deafening silence from the rest of the world. So, while we are engaged in this deliberation for the purposes primarily of US domestic concerns, and while NIH, NSABB, the US government, and the regulations that we're talking about carry enormous sapiential authority around the world, one really shouldn't overestimate the impact nevertheless. Because going back to this idea of where is the weakest link along the entire spectrum, even if we do our level best and put in very stringent regulations in this country, or for that matter, stop all gain-of-function research of concern, or stop all gain-of-function research, period. It's not going to stop the risks to the global population in terms of having perhaps an incident elsewhere in the world where these regulations don't and cannot touch. Now I go to my third heading of a reality check. So I'm a self-declared realist. Overly burdensome across-the-board restrictions may well lead to unanticipated consequences. Human frailties will reveal themselves, and oftentimes the most dangerous gain-of-function research and experiments will be driven below the radar, whether outside the purview of public sponsorship or moved entirely outside of the US, where there will be less stringent oversight and monitoring. So we should really worry about what we don't see and not necessarily what we do. I also worry about the big chill specter over all gain-of-function and related research, which is not at all healthy for science, mostly due to the uncertainty in how the broadly articulated findings and recommendations of NSABB will be translated into policy guidance, then executed by IBCs and IREs on the ground at the coalface, i.e., where is the proverbial red line going to be drawn? And I think here, whatever your position, clarity must be key. Now, some specific reactions to what I've heard and what I've read and what I've learned from all of you. Two fundamental issues that I should like to comment on. The first is the fundamental question of really the raison d'etre of gain-of-function research. In other words, is there any unique scientific value or value addedness of gain-of-function research? Or can alternative methods exhaustively derive the same knowledge set? I'm not a molecular virologist and would defer to experts who are much more qualified to comment than I. But as a general principle, it would be a brave pronouncement to preclude the possibility of gain-of-function research's unique contribution. I've learned from colleagues who do gain-of-function research, or at least are familiar with that line of work, of the two famous, or perhaps infamous, H5N1 studies that have essentially brought us here together today, identifying mutations in proximity to the hemagglutinin fusion peptide have since prompted further characterization of the fusion pH of the ferret-adapted virus. And in turn, they have provided a link to other research or follow-up research to facilitate current understanding that the acid-stable fusion pH is important in transmissibility in ferrets and by extension in humans. And this understanding has now allowed us to use phenotypic assays to assess the fusion pH of the hemagglutinin rather than individual mutations as one of the markers of mammalian adaptation. The second fundamental issue that I should like to discuss is that regarding the third dimension of defining gain-of-function research of concern. That is, resistance or not amenable to control by existing mitigation measures or pandemicity. I'm not entirely, first of all, sure which of the three is going to end up being on that particular dimension or that particular axis. But the question I have is this third dimension really orthogonal to the other two dimensions of transmissibility and virulence? Is there mileage, for example, in better defining or making more encompassing the two truly orthogonal axes of one, ease of spread, and two, lethality, as the product of interactions between agent and host, as opposed to being just innate properties of the agent only? Now, regarding recommendation 2 out of the 4 in the NSABB report, which states, and I quote, oversight mechanisms for gain-of-function studies of concern should be incorporated into existing policy frameworks. Now, in other words, do we need another layer of special oversight regulations? I haven't thought about it thoroughly enough, nor long enough to come down with a decision, and I keep a very open mind. But I'm always wary of possible unintended or perhaps even intended consequences. It may well become an implicit or tacit way of bogging things down to a death spiral with red tape. And if so, we should be at least explicit about it and upfront about it. Besides, practically speaking, there is really no stronger enforcement instrument than a public funder, i.e. the NIH, in terms of ensuring compliance. Financing has always been a powerful behavioral modifier. As for the worry about NIH or other potential funders having a role conflict in judging gain-of-function research of concern, given the NIH's statutory remit as a publicly funded federal body whose mission is to serve the public interest above all, I should hope that it shouldn't have any conflict of interest. And my last observation or reaction, given that the only quantitative assessment is that of the biosafety component, whereas the biosecurity and benefit assessments were both qualitative or at least only semi-quantitative. The risk-benefit analysis, i.e. the risk versus benefit trade-off, is far from a trivial subtraction exercise. So in other words, while the exercise by Griffin was a necessary and very useful step, it has not, at least to me, resolved definitively the original questions posed. So it makes it doubly difficult for us, really, to draw direct lessons from the RBA exercise, except that we now know much more explicitly how much more we don't really know and how much more we can't quantify. And here are my final thoughts. While what I have just said may appear to cast me to the side of the permissive, for the record, I actually agree and am very sympathetic with many of the excellent arguments of the Cambridge Working Group. In fact, I cannot be a more emphatic advocate for responsible science with proper and sufficiently robust oversight, but not so that it would squeeze the lifeblood out of bona fide scientific inquiry. Where that most delicate of balances pivot, or in other words, where the red line is drawn, should be made crystal clear, down to the littlest detail, and subject to continuous fine-tuning as we learn how to achieve an optimal balance, whatever that may mean. Thank you very much.
Next, I'm going to ask Nisreen to give us a perspective out of the Middle East.
Good afternoon. I'd like first to thank the organizers for inviting me to this meeting and to give the perspective from the Middle East regarding gain-of-function research of concern. I'm the director of Center for Excellence in Biosafety, Biosecurity, and Biotechnology in the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan. And RSS is the largest applied research institution in the region and the regional hub for biosafety and biosecurity activities. And based on that, I was asked to discuss the following questions. The first question was, what are some of the opportunities in the MENA for discussion and potential action for governance of gain-of-function research? The second one, what do you think are the risks and benefits of gain-of-function research on MERS coronavirus? And the last question, what processes do you think could be put in place in the MENA to ensure the safety of gain-of-function experiments on those viruses? I'd like first to start by saying that while the life sciences are becoming an ever more important part of our lives for health and nutrition, fuels and industrial materials, the Middle East and North Africa region lags behind other parts of the world and in addressing issues in life sciences research to ensure that natural diseases are detected and contained as soon as possible, that harmful unintended consequences of research are minimized, that labs operate safely both for their workforces and for communities in which they are situated, and that plans and infrastructure are in place to respond effectively to biological emergencies. The ongoing controversy surrounding highly pathogenic avian influenza virus and MERS coronavirus research has generated considerable discussion and debate among virologists, public health scientists, and biosafety and biosecurity experts in the United States and other parts of the world. However, in MENA region, there is considerable need for awareness raising of gain-of-function research of concern, not just for life scientists, but also for lab directors and policymakers. Scientists and policymakers often have difficulty in identifying what are the risks that need to be assessed or addressed in relation to life science research and particularly gain-of-function research of concern. For maximum benefit to society, policies and practices aimed at reducing and managing biological risks should be planned in a holistic, whole-of-government manner as part of a national biosafety and biosecurity strategies. Some many countries, such as the United Arab Emirates, are fairly advanced in their federal and emirate planning. Others have not yet begun the process of creating a national strategy. National action, while absolutely necessary, cannot always be sufficient to contain or manage biological risks. The need for effective concerted supranational efforts means that cooperating countries need to have a common understanding of the global and regional risks, which in turn requires a common risk assessment methodology and common prevention activities. While biological risks do vary from region to region and from one country to another in the same region, without a common methodology for assessing risks and formulating appropriate policies and practices to manage and mitigate these risks, any international effort will be neither concerted nor effective. So, the need for comprehensive biosafety and biosecurity strategies has been explicitly recognized by the countries of the MENA region. And this has happened at the first Biosafety and Biosecurity International Conference held in Abu Dhabi in 2007, where the countries of the region acknowledged their need for and the desire to establish such strategies nationally and regionally. The conference ended with a final statement which listed many areas in which the region needed to develop capacities and legislate with regard to biosafety and biosecurity. In May 2008, the list was developed further by a core of a group of interested experts and champions from the region into a framework document. The document maps a process by which countries of the region can develop their national and regional biosafety and biosecurity strategies. The development of national regional biosafety and biosecurity strategy enables the MENA countries to identify the biological risks to which they are exposed and mitigate them through the development of appropriate legislative system, human and physical infrastructure, and improving national preparedness and contingency planning. The approach is a holistic one, a whole of government, one-world view of all biological risk across the spectrum of natural, accidental, and intentional threats as they pertain to humans, animals, plants, and the environment, including water. While MERS coronavirus is a potential threat to global public health, it's not the only coronavirus threatening the MENA region. Little is known about the antigenic relationships among the different coronaviruses or how these relationships influence the capacity of different genetic strains to emerge in human populations. Diagnostic tools and some information on clinical features of risk factors for MERS coronavirus are now available. However, there is limited information on the sensitivity and specificity of diagnostic tools, and many clinical questions remain unanswered, including the route and time course of infection, pathogenesis of disease, and treatment options. Also, epidemiologic questions still not fully answered, including identification of animals' reservoirs and possible intermediate sources of human infection. The relative importance of different modes of human-to-human transmission, example fomite and aerosols, a risk factor for transmission and infection. Thus, basic research priorities for MERS coronavirus could include identifying basic research priorities in repetition and pathogenesis, understanding coronavirus biodiversity, studying mechanisms that regulate potential for cross-species transmission, and constructing panels of representative heterologous viruses to design, develop, and test broad-based vaccine and therapeutics, and finally, improving translational outcomes of vaccine, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Sharing scientific expertise via research collaborations and training opportunities is essential in order to address the above research priorities. In this regard, a process needs to be developed that would enable responsible and rapid sharing of research resources and data among the scientific committee. Potential issues of biosecurity and select agent status would also need to be addressed. Life sciences professionals in the region need to learn from the experiences from other regions of the world and to adopt practices and develop networks of experts. In many countries, there is a necessity to disseminate best practices in research institutions, strengthen human and lab capacity for handling, importing, and exporting of biological agents, improve standards and oversight of gain-of-function research, and involve practitioners in the development of better regulations and facilities. However, to implement a systemic program for gain-of-function research that is effective and sustainable, a certain infrastructure at the national level has to be in place as a first step to support and implement these programs. Such programs should have considerable regional and international benefits in the form of reduced risks from pandemic and epidemics of any nature and from any source, be it natural, accidental, or deliberate, by enabling earlier detection of and reaction to outbreaks resulting in aerial control and elimination, and so fewer casualties and a considerably lower risk of the outbreak spreading to other regions of the world. Second, better responses to biological crises through better risk protocols, better education, and better preparedness. Reduce unintended consequences of research, activities, and policies through a greater awareness of the issues and the policies through better communication and wider adoption of best practices and code of ethics. Fourth, better governmental policymaking and policy choices. Reduce biological accidents through better biosafety and biosecurity standards and practices. And finally, reduce risk of intentional biological crises through better design of and better security systems and procedures at biological facilities. Finally, a step forward is to identify or establish such partners or channels that can assist in the implementation of these programs regionally and internationally. Thank you.
Michael, an Australian ethical perspective.
Ron, and thank you to the National Academies. The ethics analysis white paper that I wrote pointed out numerous ways in which it's important to have an international outlook when thinking about the ethics of gain-of-function research, and that can include things like the need for engagement with other countries, harmonization of practices or policies across nations, and maybe even international decision-making. One thing that was revealed in the literature review I did was that there was a common theme or a consensus that we need broader consultation in decision and policy making regarding gain-of-function research. So one kind of criticism about things that had transpired earlier in the debate was the concern that too much of the decision making or debate had consisted among people in scientists and primarily microbiologists, and that there hadn't been enough input from the general public, and that in moving forward we need decision making and debate that involves a much broader array of stakeholders, and many authors explicitly said that that should include involvement of stakeholders from other countries because gain-of-function research affects countries globally. So that's one thing that we might be thinking about and asking for and expecting, and that is input from other countries. But is that enough? There's a real question about, who is or what is the legitimate authority for making decisions and policy pertaining to gain-of-function research? Could it be the US, for example, so long as it's getting input from other countries? Is that enough? Or is there reason for thinking that at least some decisions should be made by an international body? The point being that gain-of-function research, the benefits and the risks of gain-of-function research affect the global community at large, and that might, give some concern if there's a perception that, a particular country is making key decisions that affect all countries. Yesterday, Dr. Stanley raised the question about whether or not some especially difficult decisions should be made at the institutional level or the federal level. Should, for example, we have a FACA be making some key decisions or involved in some key decisions. We should keep in mind that another alternative is decision-making at an international level by an international body, an already existing international body or an international body that might need to be formed to answer at least some kinds of questions. One reason why gain-of-function policymaking requires an international outlook is that gain-of-function research poses issues of global justice. Justice is about the fair sharing of the burdens and benefits of societal cooperation. There might be concern about gain-of-function research that poses risks on all countries if the benefits that might result from that research aren't going to be fairly shared. For example, if the pharmaceutical or vaccine products that might be made available end up being unaffordable to some of the countries that shouldered the risks required for making those benefits possible. So this is an issue of global justice regarding benefit sharing. There's also the matter of the fair sharing of risks. Some countries are likely to be exposed to greater risks from gain-of-function research than others. That will especially be the case in situations where the gain-of-function research involves pathogens for which there are control measures, cures or vaccines or treatments or vaccines that rich countries that are available in rich countries but aren't so affordable or available in poor countries. Gain-of-function research on pathogens like that will pose greater risks arguably on poorer countries. And even in situations where the gain-of-function research might result in a new pandemic pathogen for which there aren't existing control measures, specific treatments or vaccines, might pose more risks on some countries than others. At the last National Academies meeting on gain-of-function research, it was suggested that in cases like that, the risks might be equally shared among all countries. But even if we're talking about pathogens or diseases for which there aren't cures or vaccines, often having good basic health care can make some people better, less vulnerable to the diseases in question. So in the case of Ebola, for example, we've seen that supportive care makes some difference. So that's a reason for thinking that the risks might not be fairly shared, and that's a matter of international justice. Another reason why an international outlook is important is because when we're thinking about what the standards should be for things like biosafety, we should keep the international arena in mind. And the debates about the ferret flu H5N1 studies and the questions about whether or not research like that should be done in BSL-4 as opposed to BSL-3. Some authors pointed out that it might be setting too high of a standard to demand that research like that gets done in BSL-4, because if we set a standard like that, we would be ruling out relevant research in less wealthy countries, and there was the suggestion that that would be inequitable. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for thinking about international governance and having an international outlook when we're thinking about decision and policy-making regarding gain-of-function research. These matters have been previously recognized, so there was an earlier report by the National Academies, the Lemon-Relman report, which very much emphasized front and center the extent to which dual-use research raises international problems needing international solutions, and gain-of-function research is a subset of dual-use research. There's also an important WHO document called Responsible Life Science Research that was published in 2010. And this document was really quite advanced and ahead of its time in some ways. It was largely a document providing guidance about dual-use research, but it was already talking about, lots of aspects about biosafety concerns, whereas, there was the dual-use debate that largely focused on concerns about malevolent use, and then there was what I'd call the gain-of-function turn, and that is when more attention started getting placed on biosafety concerns as well as concerns about malevolent use. So this WHO document, which is international in outlook, is already taking both kinds of concerns into account. There are several important messages in that document, some which were echoed in some of the things said yesterday, and that is, we shouldn't expect necessarily that there's going to be or should be a one-size-fits-all approach to the governance of research raising bio risks. We shouldn't have, the language yesterday was used of cookie cutter. We shouldn't have a cookie cutter approach to this. Different solutions might be more appropriate or more feasible or make more sense in some places rather than others. Another suggestion in the WHO document, Responsible Life Science Research, is that we should always be looking to piggyback existing regulations and or governance structures. So the idea, for example, is, an example is that if we need additional oversight of research with an eye to concerns about biosafety or biosecurity, well, maybe we can expand the work of IBCs or research ethics committees rather than setting up new committees to scrutinize research for threats pertaining to biosafety or biosecurity. This report also, or this guidance document also highlighted different levels in the governance hierarchy for research raising bio risks and dual-use research in particular. So, dual-use research raises questions for individual scientists, and there are certain kinds of decisions that individual scientists need to make about how to manage potential problems associated with dual-use research. Research institutions, that's a level of governance for dual-use research, and so there's decisions that institutions need to make about how they're going to manage these kinds of dangers insofar as they're at liberty given whatever the regulatory regime is. A level of governance is scientific communities. So scientific communities need to make key questions. Scientific bodies, for example, need to make key questions about whether or not they want to develop and promulgate codes of conduct and decisions about what the content of such codes of conduct would be or should be. And then there's the level of domestic governance and particular decisions they need to make. For example, to what extent do they want to be regulating, imposing hard restrictions, requiring education or oversight, and so on and so forth. And one thing specifically included was the idea that there's a key role of funding bodies in this, and the suggestion that funders should be taking risks of research into mind when deciding which projects to fund, i.e. other things being equal, it's better to fund a less risky project than a more risky project. So these were quite advanced, I think, suggestions in that document. So one of the things I was asked to talk about today is, how should we move forward? How can we achieve international governance of gain-of-function research? And as I said at the very beginning, well, there's different things that might consist in. An international outlook could involve getting input from other countries when a country like the US is deciding what to do with regard to gain-of-function research. And another thing we might hope for with regard to international governance is harmonization, coordinated policies and oversight mechanisms and so on in different countries. And then a third thing is actual international governance, and that is international decision-making and policy-making or standard setting and so on and so forth. Yesterday, Keiji Fukuda talked about one possible way of achieving the third, which would also provide harmonization and involve consultation and input from different countries. And that is the idea of, he used the language of frameworks, but there's the idea of having a treaty or strengthening existing treaties. So there could be strengthening existing treaties to deal with these kinds of problems. Treaties like the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention are setting up special new international agreements to deal with this kind of thing. Harvey Rubin, who was a previous member of the NSABB, had this idea about an infectious disease compact, so different countries would agree to work together in various ways to deal with problems of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases and infectious disease research, and he thought that something like that could play a key role in addressing problems about dual use research. And as Keiji noted yesterday, this kind of approach could be something that would be very difficult to achieve. A lot of work would be involved. It might be hard to bring about. And it's not obvious to me, what the content of such international agreements should actually be or look like to address the kinds of problems in a robust way that we've been talking about the past couple days. So, what should such a treaty look like, even if we could, hypothetically achieve one? So what might be another kind of approach? Well, there's a great example of international governance that's been achieved in research ethics, and that is research ethics. And how was this achieved? Now we have, quite widely respected international standards, guidelines, and principles that govern the research or biomedical research involving human subjects. How did that come about? Well, it largely came about from the Nuremberg Code, an international standard that was set about what should be expected with research involving human subjects, followed by the Declaration of Helsinki, which was, again, an international standard, and in this case, it was an international professional body, the World Medical Association, that said these are the guidelines and principles that should govern research involving human subjects. And a body like that, issuing an international global standard like that, has done a lot of work in bringing about harmonization and actual respect and practice of those standards and principles. So maybe we can hope for the same kind of thing in the context of gain-of-function research or research involving biorisks more generally, i.e. if we could have some setting of international standards or international guidelines or principles for gain-of-function research or dual-use research, et cetera, well, then that might be an effective way of achieving global governance. WHO is one body we might look to play a key role in the establishment of such standards. In the case of the Declaration of Helsinki, we're talking about the World Medical Association, so that's largely doctors and healthcare workers, whereas a lot of the research we're talking about doesn't necessarily involve the same kinds of professionals, and it's not obvious what other professional body exists that could be the international standard-setting body. But WHO has played a big role in setting standards for research ethics involving human subjects, and would be an obvious or a potentially obvious body to turn to for setting standards for this kind of research. So research ethics then could provide a precedent for achievement of global governance of gain-of-function research. It could provide a model for it, i.e. we could achieve it arguably in the same kind of way by having international standards set or guidelines or principles set that end up being widely recognized because of the authoritative nature of the body issuing them. But beyond that, research ethics could potentially be a chassis for the achievement of global governance of gain-of-function research, i.e. we have this existing research ethics governance regime. It's largely concerned with human subjects protection, But what we're talking about here is largely research ethics. So that regime could be expanded to take on other kinds of research ethics beyond human subjects protection. So rather than having a new kind of regime that's like research ethics, in some ways we could just expand, arguably, research ethics. Mark Lipsitch and some colleagues have often made the case that there's some principles and guidelines in research ethics that apply to gain-of-function research. And so one idea might be, okay, when we make principles and guidelines for gain-of-function research, we can have similar principles. But another kind of approach would be to make the existing research ethics governance regime explicitly say, when appropriate, that those principles apply to gain-of-function research and other kinds of research raising bio-risks, and that such principles and guidelines need not be limited to human subjects protection, i.e. we could aim for a more robust research ethics. Last but not least, some hard decisions, as I suggested at the very beginning, might need to be made by an international body. So if there's especially hard cases of research and there's the question about whether or not that research should go forward or whether or not that research should be published, if the U.S. is involved somehow, should we think that the U.S., when making such a decision, should be getting input from other countries? Or should there be an international body making those decisions or playing a key role in that decision making? And again, the WHO could arguably establish relevant bodies that could be, say, analogous to the NSABB, but at an international level, and maybe with decision-making authority rather than having a mere advisory role. There's an existing ongoing body that plays a key role in deciding what research should happen or not happen with the smallpox virus. So that, I think, could be a good model for an international body playing a key role in decision-making about gain-of-function more generally. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Open it up for comments and questions. If you go to the microphones and also identify yourself. Is anybody headed there? Maybe.
Hi, Don Burke, University of Pittsburgh, member of the organizing committee. A question for Michael on your last comments about the potential use of ethics as a scaffold or a chassis for the operationalization of the gain-of-function oversight. Could you say a little bit more about, you can look at that as from the sort of the operational advantages about we've got an existing set of structures, but there's also, is there sort of a tactical way of saying that is it more acceptable to do that? Is it more politically expedient? Would there be a sort of a broader international acceptability of that framework rather than other frameworks? It's sort of a general question about, whether is there other values of approaching it from an ethical framework?
Yeah. So maybe it's just largely a practical suggestion. It's funny, in my white paper, I provided all sorts of reasons for thinking that we need an international outlook. What ethics do is look at or analyze what should be the case. And at the last NSABB meeting, there was criticism that, the white paper didn't say anything or much about how to achieve these things. Well, that's not really the expertise of ethicists, like how to do things. In my case, I'm an engineer, and I aim to be practical, so I'm happy to think about such things. And yeah, the motivation from my mind for thinking about the chassis idea is, one, maybe that's a real way of achieving something that otherwise it might not be so obvious how we could achieve it. The treaty idea, that seems like really hard, whereas this is, gosh, there's something there. It makes a precedent. It's in line with this piggybacking idea that has been thought of in terms of committees. So there's been thought about taking advantage of existing structures in the way of committees, but here's a governance regime that we could be taking advantage of the existence of and building upon. And it seems like that regime has gaps, right? So if it's about research ethics, well, there's a whole lot of things that are really important pertaining to research ethics beyond subjects protection. And now, insofar as different things get looked at, it's in a sort of stovepiped way, so why shouldn't it all be integrated? And a lot of the same overarching values should be governing the different kinds of ethical issues that arise in research. The NSABB report, for example, very much adopts key overarching values or principles that are in the Belmont report. So it kind of makes sense to have research ethics and the different aspects of research ethics under one umbrella. So I think it makes sense, sort of conceptually. So I think there would be efficiencies and feasibilities and all sorts of good reasons. It just seems like a natural thing to do. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Jerry, and then Mark.
Jerry Epstein, DHS. This may be the wrong panel to ask this question because you're the international panel, and maybe I should reserve this for the full discussion later, but it seems to be, in terms of the degree of international engagement that the United States seeks in developing its policy, there's kind of three cases. One is the U.S. makes policy recognizing that there are international perspectives, and they have done some amount of effort to collect them, and when it goes off and makes a decision, it will do that knowing what at least some international voices have had in mind. Case two is that the United States says, well, we have an urgent need to come up with something because the moratorium is depending on that. So we'll have some sort of a contingent policy, but recognizing there's international implications, we will continue discussing a more formal approach with the international community. So some issuance of some policy with maybe a marker that things might change, and the equivalent communication to the scientific community that things might change. And the third choice is this: we shouldn't do this alone. We should do a fully international approach and just not answer the mail right now, but go ahead down one of these approaches and get a more robust international solution. So act now with a marker for international engagement, or act internationally. I'd like to know what your views are on sort of those three approaches.
Anybody want to react to that? Or?
I'm willing to say something about it.
We're just going to let it stand. Mark,
I'm happy to say something about it.
You are. Okay.
So I think resorting to the third, that need not always be the case, but in the hardest cases, the most important cases, yesterday I suggested that there's not two kinds of cases, research that is of concern and research that isn't of concern. There's a spectrum. And then at one end of the spectrum is the most concerning research. I think in cases where it's the most concerning research, especially if it really does affect the international community at large, then why should the United States government think that it has the authority to be making those decisions? And just like we think, oh, sometimes scientists shouldn't be making those decisions themselves because they affect so many others, they should be giving the decision to some other body that's the appropriate authority. So there might be some cases in the hardest, the research that's most concerning, and maybe no one country should be thinking it has the authority to be making the decision and should be handing it over to some international body if the consequences are international.
Yes, let me follow that up with the question of who should initially flag that research of being raised to that level of concern, and is the recommendation for defining gain of function research of concern that's presented by the NSAB an adequate screen to know who ought to look at it? Let's say we accepted the idea that there has to be an international dimension to this. Which is not to answer Jerry's question, but to say, supposing you did that, how would you get and know what to get there? You would, we've heard that the real research of concern is a very narrow body, and then we hear other examples which might broaden it, but it's presumably some narrow subset of research that would be of concern, and even a narrower subset that would raise it to the sort of level you describe, and I'm not sure how you would suggest getting there, but certainly that would be something that might be useful for the NSABB to consider.
So my idea is that it's not that research would be of concern or not, it would be of more or less concern. And there's not two kinds of responses. Either there's more scrutiny or not, more scrutiny if it's of concern, and then not more scrutiny if it's not of concern. But the more concerning it is, the more scrutiny it gets. So there'd be all these different levels of concern and different levels of governance and extra scrutiny. And sometimes, maybe being a bit of concern, well, that gets it into special scrutiny at the institutional level. And then it's even more a concern, well, then maybe that gets it scrutiny at the national level. And then if it's really, really, really of concern, i.e., pandemic potential, some extreme level of pandemic potential, well, then that gets it to the international level of scrutiny. So multiple levels of concern leading to multiple levels of extra scrutiny at different levels of the international governance hierarchy. So it's like scalar through and through, scalar with regard to level of concern and scalar with regard to response.
Can I just try and perhaps address the question that was just posed? I think that for anything that has got an international external dimension, like bugs, I don't think approach number one is ever a good idea. So it really falls to either approach number two or approach number three. And I think whether you pick number two or number three really depends on your trade-off between efficiency and sort of a consensual type of approach to doing things. If you pick approach number three, that is, you get everybody around the table internationally and you wouldn't try to act or come down with a definitive solution unless you actually have everybody nodding their heads, then it becomes a highly political process and it becomes very, very difficult. It's almost like trying to take everything to the United Nations. Not that it includes all countries in the world, even in those cases. And inevitably, not only does efficiency suffer, but in many instances, the content gets diluted in order to arrive at a consensus. If you take approach number two, I think it's the more pragmatic way to go in most instances. So if you take the example of say, GHSA. GHSA, I think, currently has just under about a third of the countries in the world sort of signing up to it. It's slowly gaining traction, and it's one way or one instance where the US, along with others, have taken a lead and not really sort of saying, okay, this is the definitive framework or the definitive version of it, but let's start with something and then let's get it going, and hopefully people will come and join and then try and fine-tune it. And so that would be the sort of approach, I think, that I would recommend for our present purposes.
Okay. On this side, I think more.
Thanks. Thank you. Mark Lipsitch from Harvard School of Public Health. I want to take issue with my good friend Gabriel Leung and thank him for his kind words about the Cambridge Working Group and many of the sensible things he said. But I want to take issue with the claim that regulation of gain-of-function approaches will chill research in the long term. I think that claim is both unsubstantiated and also beside the point. It's unsubstantiated in the sense that there's just no evidence. It's said often, but there's no evidence. The restrictions on this single technique, which affects about 5% of the NIAID research portfolio on influenza, chills anything except for this specific technique. Historically, the main restriction on science has been cost. Certain techniques just can't be used because they're too expensive. And what that does is stimulates clever scientists to find alternative approaches that, in that case, are less costly, in this case, would be less dangerous. Stimulating next-generation sequencing because it was too expensive to use Sanger sequencing for the human genome is perhaps a good example. Secondly, if the research puts significant lives of numbers at risk, chilling research is not actually a very important counterbalancing consideration. Nobody criticizes the Helsinki Declaration on the grounds that it's a mixed blessing because it stops a lot of bad things, but it also chills research. Finally, the example of using studying pH of activation as a marker of human adaptation is not unique to gain-of-function research and has been studied through just such alternative approaches, including comparative analysis of wild-type viruses. I'd also like to thank Gabriel again for all the other things he said. And then I have a question for Dr. Gao. If the US establishes a set of principles for gain-of-function research and what can and can't be done with US funding, what impact, if any, do you think it will have on China, and what would be the reception?
Shall I try and respond to Mark? Thank you, Mark. So I think this is probably an instance where you know, it's almost tautological, isn't it? Where the fundamental assumption or the fundamental argument or the condition is that if indeed there is always at least another way of getting to the same knowledge set. And I suppose the argument that Mark just laid out is, well, if you stop all gain-of-function research, then there will be scientific ingenuity to try and get round it and therefore arrive at the same knowledge set. But that presupposes that indeed there is no unique value addedness of the gain-of-function methodology. That is, it's wholly replaceable. So I suppose we will never really know the answer because this is actually a circular argument. I suppose what I'm trying to perhaps advance the line of argument, and I don't know whether I'm right or whether you're right, is that there is a unique, at least in the medium term, there is a unique contribution of gain-of-function research. Now, of course, in the long term, with technological advancement, God knows, you know, we will have different ways of getting to know something. But at least in the short to medium term, there is a unique knowledge set that gain-of-function research will and can provide and is uniquely positioned to provide. And if that is a presupposition, then I think that we should care about the big chill. And the big chill is not really about the 5% of NIAID funded research in gain-of-function in flu. It's really about the big chill of we were shown the big Venn diagram where there is gain-of-function research, that universal set, and then a very small circle there that's of concern. Now, the relative size is notwithstanding. I think what I think is the big chill is not even on the big universal set of gain-of-function research, but on the fringe of that big universal set, where anybody or especially the junior faculty or the junior scientists, nobody will go near even the outskirts or the fringe of gain-of-function work or gain-of-function-like work because they know of the multiple hoops that you would actually have to jump through. So, and again, I suppose there's nothing wrong with that as you advance, if we suppose that there are always an alternative way of actually arriving at the knowledge set. But if that condition doesn't hold, then it would not be a good idea to impose this big chill. So I suppose that here is where we agree to disagree.
Yeah, Mark, I think, so whatever going on here and all those research in China we are carrying on, I think we are the newcomers. I guess whatever you agree, and you this country, the United States, or the audience here, I think definitely, and we can do something that we can follow in China as well. So that's an open, this is an open question, and I think it's possible.
Kavita?
Hi there, I'm Kavita Berger from Griffin Scientific. I actually wanted to ask a question about this international sort of framework that has been discussed here and in other panels. These ideas have come up for the past 15 years or so, over and again, and never really quite implemented or materialized. And one of the things that sort of makes me sort of wonder whether it's even possible, feasible, or even worth doing is sort of the years of experience we've had with the haves and the have-nots, the developed and the underdeveloped worlds, the resources that are available and that are not available in these different countries. And it's really striking to see the last panel against this panel, where you see research being done for economic value, for health value, for agriculture, whatever it might be, and you see a lot of talk about how we need to somehow monitor, oversee, and restrict some of that. And in still thinking of the experiences we had with viral sample sharing a few years ago, where it became extremely political, extremely diplomatic sort of challenge to deal with at the World Health Assembly, how can you actually establish some sort of international body that would actually review research in countries that have a real live public health need or agricultural need or whatever it might be, right? I mean, how can you tell a sovereign nation that they can't do their research to help their own citizens? Where's the balance? How do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So how do we achieve global governance? Well, one question is, who's the legitimate authority? Who can we turn to and say, this is your responsibility, you need to own this, and you need to take this on? One question or one suggestion is does the answer to that question sound like the question, who is the legitimate authority? One might say WHO is the legitimate authority. But this raises the question about, what is the WHO mandate, and does this fit the WHO mandate? Is there a more obvious body that we should be turning to say this is yours to own and take on? As Keiji pointed out yesterday, it's hard for the WHO to do much without support of member states. So maybe catalyzing this requires member states pressuring WHO to take this on. This is really important. The potential consequences of gain-of-function research could be, globally catastrophic. This isn't a this isn't a hypothetical matter. This is something that could be, tragic. And it would be tragic if we don't get global governance until it's too late. If whatever international body is responsible for this isn't going to do anything about it until something bad happens, well, when something bad happens, that might be too late. So it's the member states maybe need to be pressuring WHO, if it is WHO that's legitimate body, saying, hey, this is within your mandate, you're the legitimate authority for this, this is something important, something needs to be done. Now, if some of the member states aren't going to be on board because they don't realize how it's relevant and important to them, well, maybe they need to be made better aware of how it's relevant and important to them. And it could be relevant and important to them in ways that might not be so obvious. I mean, one of the things that international governance should be doing is making sure that states with less resources and infrastructure and so on would receive benefits from this, and that risks to them would be reduced and so on. So it could be the advantage, and maybe not very costly for less powerful or wealthy member states to be on board with getting global governance happening.
I think what Mark just said about the Declaration of Helsinki, who enforces this for clinical trials anywhere, or clinical research anywhere in the world? It's not the WHO. Although I think WHO has got a good platform, but I think its hands rather full, and with its current budget and its current governance structure, I'm not sure that it can take it on effectively, because there's no leverage. I think it's rather that sort of, it's the peer pressure of moral responsibility, and it's that culture that we've heard about earlier this morning of the international scientific community. I think that ultimately is the long-run determinant of whether we can come to some sort of global harmonized governance structure for gain-of-function research and for others, CRISPR being the other obvious example. And I think that's sort of the long-run control knob, or the lever. But in the short run, I mean, there are things one can do in terms of capacity building, technology transfer, research grants, financial sponsorships. These are all shorter term and more immediate levers that one has in fostering that global harmonized culture in getting a handle on gain-of-function research.
Let me ask you whether you would look sooner to a WHO as a governance sort of body, or to organizations like the national academies around the world to try to harmonize relations in this area. I mean, which would be more effective in your view? A scientifically based set of bodies that considers this and how to harmonize it, or a health organization, or a different organization altogether?
I think all of the above. But I don't think that there is, I mean, if we look to either the national academies around the world or to WHO and its regional offices, I don't think their role is the policeman. So execution and enforcement is not going to be their role. I think in coming sort of to a consensus on global harmonization, yes. But in terms of policing and enforcement, it would still have to be down to the IBCs.
Thank you. That's fine.
Hi, I am David Stanley. I'm with the Future of Life Institute in Boston. So I'm mainly just here to relay a proposal that was provided by the Future of Humanity Institute and the Global Priorities Project, both in Oxford, for a proposal for making decisions about whether to fund gain-of-function research. This proposal is kind of in line with comments made by Michael and others earlier about funding agencies taking more of a role in making these decisions. Specifically, yesterday, we spoke about risk-benefit analysis as a tool for making funding decisions. Pertaining to this method, Griffin Scientific showed that risks could be quantitatively estimated to some extent. However, benefits could only be estimated qualitatively. The FHI's proposal is to utilize the scientific granting process to help make decisions about gain of research projects of concern. This specific proposal is to price the expectation value of any damages that could result from GOF research into the price of the grant being considered. Then they could either require grantees to purchase liability insurance to cover the possible damages from this, or alternatively require a payment to the state or non-state body to cover this expected cost of that research. The key advantage of this proposal is that it keeps decision-making in the hands of scientists who are best suited to evaluate the benefits of gain-of-function research, which we saw are difficult to quantify. Clearly, potential issues associated with this are finding a practical means to provide this liability insurance, and also obtaining some international adoption into evaluating these this pricing of the associated risks. So I basically was just hoping to get your feedback on possibly how to deal with these particular international issues. Thanks.
I'm not sure if anyone wants to respond to that, or we just want to have it in the record, and in the final session, maybe the chairs will take that up. I've got 4 more people and 5 minutes left in the session, so if...
I'll try to be quick. Chris Park from the Department of State. This was a very useful discussion, but while there's been a lot of talk about the need for an international perspective, there's been a real lack of clarity on why. If it's, well, we need to understand what the international community thinks as we shape our own domestic policy, yes, that's useful. It's certainly important to be aware of what second-order effects there might be, et cetera. But I'm looking at this as a practitioner. Me or someone like me will be stuck with the job of going off and persuading other governments or other actors to take some action internationally if we decide we need to do something. So what would help me quite a bit is better clarity about what. In other words, if the problem is that we actually are concerned that, well, such research is being done more broadly than just funded by the United States, conducted in the United States, and we know that's true. We know that there's quite a certain amount of this research that's being funded by the EU. We've seen articles published on research that was done in China and a number of other places. So it's not exclusively a U.S. issue. So if we think this is a problem that needs to be addressed more broadly in order to mitigate the risk, that's an important piece of information. That says, all right, that's a different solution set than just consulting widely before we go off and do what we're going to do. But then you get to the question of, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? If you are concerned mostly that what you want to do is drive the behavior of individual researchers, then I certainly agree that going the route of professional societies and things like that can be a very useful tool. And it can also be something that's used in tandem with other approaches. If your concern, however, is with the behavior of governments, the need for some form of oversight or setting a very high bar before one funds or something of that nature, then that route probably doesn't work by itself, and you need to look at something else. And then you get into the questions of, well, am I mostly concerned about security risks? The original flap over the Fouchier and Kawaoka papers was, what about the potentially enabling impact of this information, and bad guys might get hold of it? That's one problem set. If you're actually driven much more by the concern about inadvertent release, then you get into questions of, well, under what circumstances should the research be done? What should be the test applied before it's conducted at all? What might be the containment conditions? All those elements tell you different things about what entity is the most appropriate to try and tackle the problem. You might need to divide up and address a couple different problems in a couple different settings. You also get into some very practical questions about, well, do we go to a UN-style organization where you've got 190 plus members? And I can tell you from bitter experience, it is very hard to get that many people in a room and get them to agree on whether or not it is day or night. Or do you focus on the 80% solution? If there are 5 countries funding the vast majority of the research, and funding is a key element of what we think needs to get addressed, then maybe you focus on a much smaller group and try to establish a de facto pattern of this is the sort of behavior, and then you try to push it out gradually in larger circles. Again, I'm not trying to advocate anything particular, but to lay out some very practical considerations and urge those who are interested in this from the standpoint of ethics, from the standpoint of the science, et cetera, to take that into their thinking and give us some more thoughts, because it would be very helpful. Thank you.
All right, let me take the others very quickly. We've got 2 minutes.
Thank you. Catherine Rhodes from the University of Cambridge. So 2 comments. One is, again, relating to the venue in which international governance might take place. And I wondered, given some of the sort of concerns about the extension into things like animals, livestock, it would be appropriate to place it within the trilateral cooperation that takes place between the World Health Organization, the World Animal Health Organization, and the Food and Agriculture Organization. That might also help to bring greater resources to bear if you've got 3 organizations taking an interest. And then the second point is then again on resources. So in fact, to establish anything at the international level, whichever you go for, whether it's a treaty, the standards, or through the research ethics area, you need to consider the resourcing for this. And if you aren't going to get sufficient and sustainable resourcing, then it may be better not to start.
KG Fukuda, WHO. Let me maybe give a couple of observations and maybe some ways to help think this through. I think that at the global level, there's different kinds of issues, and some of the discussions are more successful and others are less successful. So if we look at some of the more successful discussions, for example, the development of the international health regulations, this was successful because the heart of that discussion was that countries need to be better prepared. It was not an argument that anyone had to be convinced of. It was an accepted argument. And it really became more or less of a discussion about how do you achieve that. And there was, of course, a lot of discussion. It was not so straightforward, but that was the heart of the discussion. If you look at the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, again, something which took about 5 years of very difficult negotiation, the heart of the issue is very clear. This is an unfair situation. Can it be made more fair? And so, again, a very difficult discussion about how do you achieve that fairness. But still, the basic need for the discussion was not questioned. And I think in the current era now, you know, the issue that I focus a lot of time on, antimicrobial resistance, even though it's complex, again, the fact that you cannot have a situation where you don't have effective antibiotics is not really questioned by anybody. It's that given all the complexities, how do you achieve it? You then have discussions which are very difficult. You know, for example, well, I won't go into these examples, but there are discussions which are very difficult because it's not clear whether there is an issue that everybody agrees upon that in fact is worth discussing or is of importance. And when I think about this issue and the genesis of it over the past 4 or 5 years, you know, particularly when we had the H5N1 studies, the difficulty of this discussion has been how do you weigh risks and benefits of a situation in a societal context. Among the influenza scientists, you have one culture, which I understand very well. Even among other scientists, however, that is not very much the same. But once this issue became an issue in which you had media, you had very prominent personalities arguing it, you had export regulations brought in, you had the commerce departments and so on, who had foreign affairs involved in this discussion, it quickly became a very difficult discussion because how you measure these things is not straightforward. And I think that the measurement of risk in a very narrow sense can be done quantitatively. On a political sense, it is a completely different set of methods. You look ahead for other kinds of issues. So the measurement of risk is not so easy. The measurement of benefits is not so easy. And it very much depends on the perspective you're bringing. In a lot of ways, I think that this is an issue which is immature to come to the global level in terms of governance, except at the level that there needs to be a scientific consensus. I think right now it is not clear whether there is a scientific consensus across the many different societies worldwide. And I think that the issue may be a microbiological issue. Certainly you define it as a gain-of-function issue, but I think it's a little bit broader than that in reality. And I think some of the points that were raised, is it enough to have this discussed just among scientists who are dealing with human outcomes, or do you also need to bring in microbiologists working in other sectors? But I think an issue in which there is no broad scientific technical consensus is in a very difficult place if you then try to bring the political elements, which inevitably any global governance discussion brings in. So anyways, 2 cents.
Thank you. One last comment because we're already into the break time. And
okay, sorry. Yes, Celia Bönicke, University of Freiburg. I have one short remark and one question. The short remark would be, I would like to add to the international dimension, and I very much support a lot of the things Michael Selgelid said, the hard law, the hard international public law. In regard to the liability or responsibility of states. If a state allows that an agent escapes from a state laboratory and causes damage in other states, there's a good case to argue that a state is responsible to pay reparation. And this is not a question of ethics, this is a question of customary international law. And I have colleagues who to argue this way. And I think in regard to the risk-benefit assessment, at the government level, one should take this into account, this risk as well. My question would be to Nisreen and to George, whether they think that their governments would push an international initiative to regulate gain-of-function at the WHO level or UNESCO level or United Nations level. Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah. Regarding, like Jordan is, signatory for many international conventions. Regarding gain of function, still we don't have any experiment of concern in Jordan or in the region regarding mares. Only what we have is surveillance for, cases in the country and in the region. We have international health regulation point of contact at the Ministry of Health, and we on annual basis, and if anything happens, we report to the WHO international health regulation through this mechanism.
No more comments.
China.
No. I'll just thank the panel then, and thank the audience and everyone who did get to make a comment or a question. We will have a short break, and then we will follow with the last session. So thank you again.